Austria are mandating vaccines. From February the 1st, if you're in Austria, you gotta be vaccinated. Does that sound worrying? And have Austria got any historical lessons they could glance back at that gives them some guidance on how they should maybe behave in situations around mandating? Hello there, you 4 million wonders, you shimmering comets, you glorious starscape. Now, we're going to be talking about a serious issue. It's vaccine mandates. Of course, I'll be careful to stay within the regulations of YouTube while discussing this and express no opinion on vaccines themselves or medical procedures. Simply, an open discussion will be taking place during this video, me doing most of the talking, the news participating to a point where we discuss the idea of mandating lockdowns, the introductions of emergency powers, and try to some degree to place them in a historical context in a serious grown-up way, in spite of the cardigan. I also want to let you know if you're in the UK, between January and May, I'm performing loads of dates. Some new ones are going to come available in Scotland too. Click on the link in the description, sign up to my mailing list. I'll give you details at the end. But now let's understand what is going on in Austria.
On Saturday, protesters making their feelings known, not just about lockdown, but about the mandatory vaccinations plan for February.
These protests are happening all over the world. They're happening in the Netherlands, they're happening in the UK, they're happening in Australia. All over the world, a significant percentage of the population are concerned about vaccine mandates. I don't know if they're concerned about vaccines and the consequences of vaccines or simply the mandates themselves. But let's be clear about something. We are facing an unprecedented situation, and I suppose we have to individually and collectively work out if the trade-off is a worthwhile one. Presumably, the argument for mandating vaccines and lockdowns is that the spread of coronavirus is so rampant and the consequences so dreadful that these measures, which some would consider draconian, have to be taken. And I suppose the protests suggest that there are a significant number of people that do not believe that to be the case. Perhaps they query the logic, perhaps they query the science. One area where I would be happy to nail my colours to the mast is every time you take away people's freedoms, you have to really be sure you're doing the right thing. And I would say a way that you would know that the right thing was being done is transparency around information, open discourse in public, no censorship. These would all be signs that what was happening was something that was open, fair and free. You could evaluate for yourself whether you think the criteria that I've just loosely listed are being met. Let's have a look a little more closely at what's going on there.
This massive crowd in Vienna objects to COVID restrictions being reintroduced.
I'm a free Austrian who wants to be free and live free in this country.
Liberté!
If you are a person who accepts authoritarianism, perhaps your perspective is this is a unique situation, authoritarianism is necessary, we need to yield to authority, then I suppose surely a caveat to that would be after a democratic process, after a public discourse. Otherwise, I suppose what we're saying is we don't want democracy anymore, not in regard to this issue. We want authoritarianism. And if that is your position, I suppose I respect your position, my concern would be that at some point that authoritarianism will find application elsewhere.
We know that the virus is there, but we leave it to people to decide whether or not to be vaccinated.
I came to give my opinion about freedom of expression and individual choice, and really to be able to respect everyone's choices.
I suppose my own reflective, speculative concerns are based on my observations of how power has behaved previously around, for example, the Cold War, terrorism, and less blatantly but still observably, potential biochemical warfare. If you watch Adam Curtis's documentary The Power of Nightmares, you can see how the threat of the Cold War was used to create a degree of social compliance during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and how the war against terror similarly was used to usher in new legislation. All of these things are pretty easy to observe. More latterly, biochemical warfare was used to tentatively explore areas of regulation. So the idea of a kind of war against germs or a war against COVID type mentality where non-compliance is seen as disruptive, for me is certainly cause for inquiry and question. Anything that seems like it's restricting human freedom without sufficient evidence that that this is the only course, the best course, the necessary course, and that there is a consensus around that, would perhaps be cause for concern.
But even those who have taken the jab are sometimes suspicious.
When we're saying that it's 95% effective at the beginning, we're seeing that's definitely not the case now. We're saying no more lockdowns, yet we're in lockdowns now. How can we really trust the information that's being given to us at the moment?
I'm vaccinated, but I did it just because we had this rule where we can only get into bars and restaurants and stuff with vaccination.
Perhaps democracy has always been somewhat vague and illusory. Perhaps many of the choices that we believe we are making are as a result of behavioural nudges that require us to behave in a certain way. Rats led down particular pathways in an all-pervading maze. But certainly this issue has brought to the forefront a good deal of resistance, and given the contributions of many of the people blessedly in this televised news footage, it's easy to see why there could be some concern. Dr. Agnes Arnold Foster and Dr. Caitlin Gainty are health historians working on Healthy Skepticism, a project that examines historical and contemporary medical skepticism. Austria is to become the first European country to make vaccinations against COVID-19 mandatory. The proposal has been met with substantial opposition, partly fueled by the far-right Freedom Party. But over the weekend, 40,000 people protested in the streets of Austria, including many unaffiliated to the right-wing extremists. As a person that's attended a good many protests in my lifetime, I've always noticed more extreme contingents included within the broader, less politically specific component of the protest. I think it's inevitable that extremists from the left, the right, from all over the place will attend protest movements, because protest movements are one of the ways that change can come about. And just because there is a component of a protest that is far right, far left, far anything, that oughtn't delegitimise the entire movement, particularly if something is very well attended, as seems to be the case in these multinational protest movements, because by virtue of their ubiquity there is a good deal of concern. And sometimes I feel that the reporting on the extremist faction is a way of delegitimising the entire movement. Opposition has been framed in terms of medical ethics, bodily autonomy, and resistance to an overly interventionist state power. This is a politically risky decision. History reveals significant problems with compulsory vaccinations. Indeed, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that mandates increase hesitancy rather than reduce it. In 1853, the English government made smallpox vaccination compulsory. As in Austria today, this new policy was met with widespread protest. It kick-started a concerted and coordinated anti-vaccination movement that spread across the globe. The irony. There's no vaccine for the human spirit, baby. There were riots in several industrial English towns like Leicester, and new anti-vaccination leagues were established. These leagues published pamphlets and held rallies and communicated with kindred spirits abroad. The Anti-Vaccination Society of America was founded in 1879 following a visit by leading British anti-vaccinationist William Tebb. Compulsory vaccination was understood as a tool of an increasingly interventionist government, and many of the protesters were working class people who had been living under the brutalising regime of workhouses and the poor law. I suppose one of the things that sort of jars mentally is the idea, this is for your own good. We've got to do this for the good of everyone. It's not just for your health, it's for everyone's health. Where was this mentality when these people are starving to death on the street? Where was this mentality when people were losing their homes and houses? Where was this mentality with the quantitative easing of 2008? It's difficult to trust the ideas behind it, the stated ideals, because it jars with historical resonance and what we've observed happening. Oh yeah, this the government. You know, those guys always do what's best for you. Yeah, well, this must be what's best. Who are they working in league with? It's not anyone with a bad history of having to do payouts, is it? No. Hold on a minute, it says it's pharmaceutical companies. In 1898, the British Parliament passed an act to allow parents to opt out of the compulsory system, and the legislation was expanded in 1907. Since then, and in contrast to many other Western nations, Britain has avoided vaccine mandates entirely. Indeed, though, you can make a convincing case that Britain was the birthplace of the 19th century global anti-vaccination movement. In the 20th century, vaccines became unusually popular in the UK. This change was neither linear nor straightforward, but concerted campaigns on behalf of an increasingly respected well-respected, well-resourced and trusted welfare state and scientific community transformed controversial routine vaccinations into commonplace medical interventions. I suppose that's a good way of understanding how people react to coercion and mandating. If what you have is a state or a set of infrastructural agencies that are seen as benevolent because it's clear that their intention is service and help, for example, the National Health Service in our country, the United Kingdom, is generally regarded with a great deal of positivity because whenever you go there, you see that everyone's really lovely and kind and trying their best. But if there is this sort of bureaucratic, technocratic push in league with corporations, it's not so easy to go, oh, well, this is clearly motivated by benevolence and altruism. We know them by their fruits. At this stage of the pandemic, Austria, along with other nations, has already vaccinated those who will do so voluntarily. We know from both historical data and more recent experience that at least some of those who remain are likely to have deep-seated suspicions of both public health systems and the state, often born of experiences of marginalisation and memories of abuse and exploitation. Vaccine mandates will do nothing to ameliorate these concerns. Indeed, they are more likely to exacerbate them. Ultimately, history cannot predict whether Austria's new vaccine mandate will succeed in achieving a higher national vaccination rate, but it does suggest that such mandates must be approached with great caution. Government compulsion does not always achieve increased vaccine uptake, and when it does, it can come at the expense of trust and social inclusion. There are no hard and fast rules here. Instead, what history does make clear is that the success or failure of vaccine mandates are deeply contingent and dependent on national context and the historical moments in which they take place. A lot to consider. What a fantastic article. And please, those of you watching this, remember that I have not at any point endorsed or denied vaccines. I have no opinion on what you should do for your personal health. I neither see myself as a necessary advocate for a government policy nor a person who has to necessarily decry it. My job, I feel, is to participate with you, a person that I respect, on the level of equals, communicating about our individual and collective lives and the society, nay, civilization, suggested by that communication. In fact, to communicate is to create community, and without it, we do not have community. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think this is an important moment for Austria? Do you think that this is the possibility for a new global movement? What lies behind it? Do you trust your government? Do you trust the media? Do you trust big business? Let me know exactly what you feel. Give me a thumbs up. You won't be giving me a thumbs down. That